mostly inspired Mandy's love of history, her college professor. We're going to talk about women in World War I. Dr. Leslie Heaphy is an associate professor of history at Kent State University, Stark campus. She's the author or editor of 6 books on the Negro Leagues, women's baseball, and the New York Mets. She also knows a lot about women in World War I. She is the editor of the national peer-reviewed journal, Black Ball. She serves as vice president for the Society of American Baseball Research and chairs their Women in Baseball Committee, while she also serves on the board of directors for the International Women's Baseball Center. She is a good friend to the museum, and you've enjoyed her previously as a brown bag speaker, and I know you're going to love the program today. Dr. Leslie Heaphy.
Welcome. Thank you very much. I'm glad everybody's here. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
All right. If you can't hear me, just wave at me, because I have a tendency to kind of step away. I'll try not to, because I know everybody will. If you can't hear, there's no point in being here, right? My dad used to tell me, if you talk too fast or they can't hear you, then what's the point in standing in front of people? I'm like, okay, that's a good point. I can't believe how much stuff you've got going on. That's amazing. Wow, you could be here every day. And I'm expecting my own signed copy. I heard some of you are here every day. There you go. Do they let you go home? No, they said, uh-oh, slave drivers back here. All right, well, we came to talk a little bit about women in World War I, which is a fascinating topic, and I said, what, I got 40 minutes to do that? I teach an entire semester that covers that, so I was like, all right, I have to figure out how to do this. Then I walked in and I saw the wonderful posters that you got up on the wall behind you. I haven't seen them in addition to, and I was looking at them and I was like, oh, a women's one, okay, all right. Because the thing that fascinates me when we talk about this kind of time period is, I always tell my students, it's funny how often you hear that women went to work for the first time in World War II. I'm like, really? And yet you hear that over and over and over again, you read it in books, and I'm like, excuse me, I don't think so. So then students go, well, what do they mean when they say that? They can't be entirely wrong. And of course, what they think they mean is that women went to work in certain industries for the first time, which is also not true. But we have a tendency, particularly in this country, to skip over World War I like it kind of was just this little blip on the screen and we jumped to World War II. Because after all, World War I, as we know, officially started in 1914, ends in 1918, and when did the United States get involved? 1917, see? So technically, if you think about it that way, we're only involved for 1 year. So that's not really a big deal, right? And so that's where some of that comes from. And I will not fill your heads with lots and lots of stats, but there are some really fascinating ones. I'll just tell you one. Just here in this country, at the start of World War I, in 1914, less than 2% of our entire workforce in factories and industrial was women. By 1918, that had risen to nearly 20%. Right? So, once again, anyone that says, well, women entered certain industries in World War, no, they were actually doing that long before that. Nobody just happened to recognize that idea. World War I, a fascinating era for a whole variety of reasons, and one of the things you have to remember when we think about World War I is World War I is the first time that people officially labeled a war with the term total war. Now that's not to say that wars before that and war isn't always that idea, but it's the first time anybody really labeled it that way. And that's why this becomes important, because if you think about that term, it means war affects every single person, no matter how old you are, no matter your gender, no matter where you live, no matter whether you are on the front lines or not. Now think about that. That's always true. But by World War I, that becomes a reality because mostly of technology and the way the world is changing, right? Because we're going to see much more mobility, people are connected to one another. Think about just in this country the huge numbers of people who through the latter part of the 19th century started coming into the United States, right? From all over, so there are connections everywhere. It's part of the reason why Woodrow Wilson in World War I told us that we had to be neutral in, and listen to this, thought, word, and deed. Now we can all figure out how you are neutral in your deeds, and maybe even in your words, but how does anybody know what you're thinking in your head unless it comes out your mouth? But that was the idea. And so when you start to think about those kinds of things, that's going to involve everybody. And so one of the keys in World War I, not just here in the United States, but everywhere, is the participation of women. When the United States entered World War I, the war had been going on for 3 years at that point, and we came in basically as the replacement for Russia. Russia's leaving, we're coming into the war at the same time. Russia, of course, plays one of the most interesting roles for women in the entire World War I. Because if you want to know and think about all the potential roles that women can play, one of them, of course, is fighting, is actually being out there on the front lines. And that's not happening in World War I. That's even still not happening in most places. But in Russia, they had 15 battalions of women who were fighting by 1915. 15 battalions of 6,000 women on the front lines. Led by a woman by the name of Maria Badarokeva. And her first battalion, she called the Battalion of Death, because that's what they were bringing. 6 of those women won the highest awards that you can get in Russia. They led the way. And that's one of the more unusual places where we see women, because it's just not something happening in that time period. But it did occur in Russia, and it was occurring unofficially in one other place in the world. Anybody want to hazard a guess? Over in Asia. They've had female leaders of their military for hundreds of years. I heard, there you go, China, very good. China is the other place where we're going to see some of that happening. But we don't think about that one because a lot of people don't realize China's involvement in World War I. They were kind of off our radar screen in the United States at that point. So there are lots of ways we can think about women's participation. So think to yourselves, what could be the possible ways that women participated in World War I? And the answer is everything you can think of, either officially or unofficially. Everything you can possibly think of, from fighting, to spies, to nurses, ambulance drivers. Okay? And then you fill in some of the other blanks, like, entertainers, writers, radio operators, translators, recruiting agents, etc., etc., etc. In fact, one of the things our government and the British government discovered was if you wanted the best people to run your radio operations and your communications, that was women. And you can probably guess a couple reasons why, and one of them is that standard always idea that who likes to gossip more, right? But more importantly, that standard idea, which to a certain degree, and you can all think about this yourselves, and don't answer it, right? You don't want to get yourselves in trouble, right? Women are better multitaskers, is the general idea, right? And so think about what's happening. And so, not surprisingly, women are going to serve in significant roles in the Army, the U.S. Army Signal Corps, for example, which was started during World War I. We had 300 bilingual operators that were all female who went to the front lines in France and served in that particular role. We'll come back to that here in a second. Probably, obviously, the most logical place we think about is women as nurses. Women through the Red Cross and the International Red Cross. And that is where we're going to see the largest numbers, both here in this country and pretty much anywhere else, both as volunteers and then in official roles. The role of nurses is dramatically different in World War I from every war that precedes it, particularly in this country, because by World War I, we finally have the Red Cross, and we have the International Red Cross, which were created after the Civil War, right? And why is that important? Well, that gives female nurses actual training and standing, which they didn't have previously. During the Civil War, as many of you may know, Dorothea Dix created our understanding of nursing in this country and came up with the first criteria to really change the way nurses were thought about. And her criteria was very simple. You had to be over the age of 25, and you either had to be already married or homely. And you can think about why, right? Notice there's nothing in that that says, I I'm skilled, I know what I'm doing, I can help you, I might be able to bandage, right? That was not part of that original criteria. And so that's kind of where we started. By the time you hit World War I, we're going to see some of those same issues still coming up. There's a description in one of the explanations for one of the volunteer organizations that the women still had to be over the age of 25, and they could only serve in certain roles if they were not married to somebody who was serving overseas. They didn't want that to be a conflict, or you worried about them and not doing your job. And then it said underneath, preferably homely. So no longer that you had to be, but that was preferred. So think about that if you got accepted. You're like, what does that say about me? And yet, if you look at some of our propaganda of World War I, which explodes, right? And you can look behind you and there's a couple of them on the walls right here. Those women are anything but homely. So in our propaganda, to get people to serve and to draw attention, we are going to go the other direction, right? But in nursing, that was not the case. Over 20 million wounded soldiers in World War I, in addition to the millions who died, right? So there's your necessity for nurses, right? Just when you think about those numbers. The Red Cross in 1914, and just in this country alone, had only 107 chapters. By 1918, there were almost 4,000. Over 20 million volunteers and 11 million in the Junior Red Cross. Almost all female. About 3% of that was male, the rest of it is all female. So again, thinking about women's participation. And of course right here in Massillon, as you probably well know, and in Stark County itself, the idea of that in Alliance alone, in 1 year, 1917, they raised $25,000 for local participation in the war. In Canton, they served more than 200 disabled veterans in the 2 years immediately after the war. In Massillon, there were 24 local chapters of the Red Cross. They produced, and again, just to sort of put 111,000 gauze dressings, almost 13,000 muslin dressings, and the list goes on and on and on in terms of what we were doing. The National Red Cross obviously playing a significant role. The one thing that was true, and this is one of the issues with the time period we're talking about, African American women were not allowed to participate in the Red Cross. They were not given permission until the very end of the war in early in 1918. The exception to that was that there were 18 black women who did take part and were sent to Camp Sherman here in Ohio and were offered assignments there to work with the soldiers before they left and to help here on the home front. And so that is unfortunately typical of that time period. When you think about other kinds of things that women did, well, let me throw out a few more specific examples. I think one of the most fascinating stories are the women writers. Women who went and talked about what was happening on the front lines, right? And probably one of the most famous is a woman by the name of Helen Johns Kirtland. I kind of like her because, well, if you know my first name is Leslie, she worked for Leslie's Weekly, the newspaper at the time. Helen Johns Kirtland was over in France and Belgium for the entire course of the war, wrote over 1,500 stories. And I would suspect that almost no one knows anything about her today. And Mandy will like this. In addition to her writing stories, she was probably one of the most prolific photographers of the war. Much of her photography is not credited to her, it is credited to other people. And again, that shouldn't surprise anybody in the room given the time frame we're talking about. But Helen Johns Kirtland gave us a lot of incredible coverage from the war front. And she was not alone. Every country sent women in as reporters. Sometimes people thought, well, they'll get a different kind of story. They're only interested in sort of the day-to-day, who are these people? No, they were telling the same stories. They were taking photographs of the battles themselves, of what was happening. They did not shy away from those kinds of stories. And so she's a good example. Compare that with the other area where you found a different group of writers that were very popular in World War I, and that was in the entertainment area. We think about World War II, right? We think about Bob Hope and the USO and all. Well, that started in World War I. In World War I, the most common entertainers were women who went over as dancers and readers of poetry and dramatic readings, which isn't necessarily what you would think about, right? But we have lots of examples of women writing and then reading poetry, both about the war, about the experiences, but a lot of it is really more about what it was like to be a 19, 20, 21-year-old, 22-year-old experiencing what they were experiencing. And then many of them are going to write about their experiences after the war. And probably one of the most well-known, but not for this, is Edith Wharton, right? I see a few heads nodding. Edith Wharton wrote The Age of Innocence, looking at, and it's been made into a movie, very well-known writer of that time period. But in 1929, she also wrote about her experiences being over in France and other places with the nursing corps and working and talking about what it was like to experience the kinds of things they experienced. And what she was talking about was the unique thing about World War I, unlike any other war, right? If you think about World War II, what dominates the battlefields? Tanks, airplanes, all of those kind of things. What dominates World War I? Trench warfare, right? And when you think about that, that's an experience that no one should ever have to go through, and we certainly would never want to see it again. But those soldiers who are there are spending their entire lives in those trenches. Not a couple days, not a couple weeks, but months and years in those trenches. And those are the stories, and those are the events. So what do you do when you're not fighting? Filling time, right, in those trenches. And so the idea of entertainment, and this was happening as close to the front as you could possibly get. Way closer than you could get today because of technology, but remember again, in World War I, you spent most of your time in your trenches waiting to see what was going to happen, and occasionally you'd pop something up to see if the enemy is still there, but nothing much happened except people died. By 1917, right, almost no land had changed hands, almost no territory had been won, and yet millions of people died. And so the entertainers, women served that role and are going to continue to serve that role as we move into the World War II experience. A couple other interesting ones, and I said, you guys had cookies today, but you really should have had donuts, right? And I see heads nodding, because one of the other very interesting roles were the donut lassies, or the donut girls. And I find two things about that fascinating right off the top. They're not donut women. They are donut lassies and donut girls, right? Which is, again, indicative of the time period, and nobody thought much about that idea. That whole program of the donut girls and the donut lassies started in Indiana, of all places, and then spread, and it started serving the canteens and things here at home, and then literally taken overseas and serving right on the front lines to the soldiers who were there. Again, that notion of total warfare, it affects everybody. And that's going to continue into World War II. But it started in World War I, and it started not too far to our west in Indiana. Going along with that idea, we also know that in 1915, 16, and 17, Girl Scout cookies started to be sold in order to raise money for the war effort. And the first troops to do that were out in Muskogee, Oklahoma. And small town thought that this was one of the ways they could contribute. That they needed to raise money, and what better way to do it than to sell something that they had available, right? And that connects then, so you have the donut lassies, you have the hello girls. The hello girls, right, being the ones that were the radio operators, communications experts, training experts, liaisons. They also had to be over 25. Didn't care what they looked like. There was no description of that at all, because you were just listening to their voice. You weren't going to see them most of the time. So most of the time, you have no idea who they were. But they were, they all had to be bilingual, and most of them that meant French. But there were also some who spoke German, and we have a few who spoke Dutch that we know about. And then most of these things that we talk about here in the United States are being replicated in other countries, with a couple of exceptions, but for the most part they're being replicated elsewhere, right? And so women are participating in these kinds of roles, and then you get to the question of the military. And of course, in 1914, 15, 16, and 17, in this country, women are not going to participate in the military, right? That would be wrong, thank you. I was just waiting, see, I'm doing like my students, I was going to say, they're all waiting to, do I say it, do I not say it, am I going to be right, am I going to be wrong? They did participate in World War I, particularly in the Navy, and the Navy was the first to allow women to actually sign up as yeomen, right? As yeomen, and their slogan to encourage women to sign up was, "Free a man to fight." Come take his place, because this is not as important, and he can go do something else that's much more important. And so that, of course, is going to carry over. That's not a new idea. World War II, right? If you think about the female pilots of World War II, they did all of the planes that just simply, we got to ferry them over there because, well, you don't want to waste a man on that, so we'll let them go. And so the Navy was the first. And as a result of the Navy allowing women to participate, they did not fight on the front lines. They simply were there again to work as transportation, clerical work, radio operators, they were great recruiters. They used them a lot as recruiters. But there were over 16,000 who signed up for the Navy. 6 of them won the highest honors that you can win in the military in World War I, and for their participation and their essential duties in bringing about victories. And so recognizing the importance of what they were doing. Unfortunately, when the war ended, none of these groups, whether it was the yeomen in the Navy, the Coast Guard that's going to come along and allow women, etc., all decided that when the war was over, what are women supposed to do?
Go home.
You can say it nice and loud.
Go home.
They're supposed to go back home, right? And that meant, well, you were never really officially in the military, so we don't recognize you as veterans, and we're not going to, and then we don't have to pay you, we don't have to do anything for you. And the Army Signal Corps, as the example, is not going to be recognized as an official part for their participation in World War I until 1978. That those women were actually, and obviously for many of them that's a posthumous recognition, and that will continue through World War II and beyond. The idea that women were necessary, but only so far, and then when that necessity goes away, women should go back home and continue. Because the slogan of the 1920s was, return to normalcy. Right? Same as in the 1950s. Slightly different tagline, but the same idea. So when there's no more need, women go home, right? You've helped out, now that's done, go back to what you've been doing. And so that was kind of the, and think about that slogan, free a man to fight. Women, we need you to come along, get involved right now, and then go back to what you're best at, which is staying home, taking care of the kids, right? All of those kinds of things. We're still in the time period where the public world was basically the man's world, and the private world was the woman's world. Because remember, in this country, and we'll focus on that for a moment, when did women get the right to vote?
1920.
1920, after the war is over, right? And so that whole idea of women's participation, now at the same time recognize that while women did not have the right to vote on the national level, by 1914, 30 of the states had already granted women the right to vote at the state level and at things that affected them on the local level. A lot of people don't realize that, which is how some of these things happen. And so it's just that last stage. And that's another part of the war that's really fascinating because, again, you don't think about it, but most historians would argue that the only reason women got the right to vote in 1920 is because of World War I. It would have come eventually, but it would have been farther down the road. Because the decade that follows, the 1920s, was certainly not going to be the decade women were going to get the right to vote, because we weren't thinking about serious things then, right? Golden Age, the Roaring Twenties, the Flappers, all of those kinds of things. And so World War I affects was the politics of the day, not surprisingly. And in this country, the push for women's suffrage, which had officially started in 1848, right? So you do the math. If my math is correct, and I'm not a mathematician, right? That's 72 years before 1920. So, in an effort to do that, what changed? Well, World War I changed things. And women were starting to realize that they could take advantage of Woodrow Wilson's idea about we got to be neutral in thought, word, and deed, and we must support the war 100%, which meant to him no strikes, no protests, nothing that took away that we were not united in our efforts. So ladies, what do? You go out and you protest, and you march. And they started marching in 1912 and 1913, and by 1915, held a march in New York City with 17,000 people. Might not seem like a lot today, but that was a lot in 1917. But that wasn't enough. So what else do you do? Oh, you follow our British example. And you send women over and they come back with an idea. The idea was, marching is not enough, signing petition. So we're gonna go and we're gonna chain ourselves to the fence outside the White House in protest. And of course, that'll get Woodrow Wilson's attention and everybody else because that's not what he wants. So what does he have to do to get you to stop? Well, he throws you in jail first and foremost, which they did. And then the women said, all right, we'll do something else. We'll go on a hunger strike. But that got newspaper attention, so you can't have that. So what do? You force feed them. Oh gee, like that won't get you attention, and very negative attention, which it actually did. And it is that kind of progression that ultimately leads to the decision to allow women to have the right to vote in 1920. Woodrow Wilson didn't want any of those protests. Woodrow Wilson himself has said in more than one occasion in his own writing that personally, he wasn't really in favor of women getting the right to vote. Which is kind of interesting if you think about what happens to Woodrow Wilson at the end of the war and his wife is running the country. You know, and so I don't think he told her what exactly he thought. But Woodrow Wilson and Congress, ultimately, and then the states, are going to give women the right to vote on the national level. But at the same time, it almost failed. And there's a great story, and yes, it's a little apocryphal, but sometimes you have to tell apocryphal stories, right? Supposedly, when the women's suffrage vote came up for vote in Congress on the day before, one of the, remember you gotta have a certain number of states support these things when it's an amendment, right? And so, coming up for the vote, looked like we were gonna come up one state short. And a young senator from Tennessee got a call from his mother the night before the vote, and she told him, if you want me to continue to do your laundry and feed you, you know what you need to do tomorrow. Whether that story is true or not, he voted for the amendment, and it passed. So I kind of like to think it's true. So there's another example of, she used her influence to say, you want me to continue? Then you are going to help me. So women's suffrage is one we don't often think about as a major part of this particular experience. Okay? The last piece I wanted to talk a little bit about before I run out of time, time goes by too fast, is women's spies. Because we don't necessarily think about that. And there aren't a lot of them here in the United States, but man, there are some fascinating ones. And you'll all recognize probably the most famous spy. Mata Hari, right? I figured that was going to be the name that everyone would recognize. A Dutch exotic dancer by profession, executed in 1917 for her participation in France. She was executed as a German spy. But she was only one of, we have identified over 35 female spies operating in World War I. And that means those are the ones that got caught. So that tells you how many others. Probably actually, Mata Hari got famous for both who she was and what happened to her, but probably the most famous female spy in World War I was a woman who came to be known by a name she picked for herself because it was easier to pronounce. She was simply known as Alice Dubois. And she ran what was known as the Alice Service all throughout England. Spy networks And there were 35 branches of her spy networks operating throughout England to pass information. That service was then replicated in France and Belgium, and they all called themselves, after her, the Alice Service. There were identified in her roles alone 155 women who were taking part in that kind of experience, and that's building on what happened in the Civil War. Unfortunately, she did get caught, and she was executed as well by the Germans. And she doesn't get nearly the attention because she wasn't the exotic dancer, she wasn't the behind, she was the homely one probably in that respect. Right? And so it's an interesting thing to think about when we stop and think about World War I and the importance of that war in terms of, I always find it fascinating people want to skip over World War I because the entire 20th century is basically defined by World War I. And quite frankly, you can't not include women, both in this country and in every part of the world, because they're there in everything you can think of. Whether it's here in this country, in France, in Scotland, they created a nursing corps that wanted to go overseas to help, and they first offered their services to the British as nurses for their hospitals. You know what the British said to them? Ladies, go home and be still. So the Scottish said, fine, we'll go offer our services to the Belgians and to the French and to the Dutch, and they did, because the British didn't want them. Right? Ladies, go home and be still. Ladies, stay home. Final thing, ladies who did stay home, right, what did you do? Well, you raised money, you sewed, you boycotted things, and you got involved in probably the biggest thing in this country, which was the Women's Land Army. 20,000 women involved in agriculture, specifically to raise food for our troops so that we wouldn't have the same experience we had in the Spanish-American War when we killed some of our own soldiers with bad food. You can look that one up, the white meat controversy. I'll just leave you with that particular thought. Yeah, so ladies, every single part of the war goes back to, and I will end on this thought, George Washington and others saying in the American Revolution that we could not have won the war without the ladies. Continued to be true. Didn't matter what war it was, doesn't matter. Because every role that is necessary, women are there, whether they're being recognized or not. So, a little bit of an overview and a touch spot. It's a huge topic. But thank you for your kind attention. I wanted to make sure I ended in time, and I think I did it right just about on the mark, because I know some people have places to go. So, thank you very much.